The Karen Read case has divided Massachusetts. It's one of the most fascinating cases in true crime history, one that's drawing national interest, not only because it's perplexing, but because it has all the dramatic elements of a feature movie. In addition to a compelling mystery at the core, there are layers of intrigue, questions within questions. The prosecution accuses Karen Read, the girlfriend of Boston cop John O'Keefe, of slamming into him with an SUV with malicious intent. The defense paints the picture of one of the most unlikely conspiracies in the history of true crime, one where O'Keefe went into the home of another Boston cop, Brian Albert, was attacked, carried outside, and left for dead in the middle of a blizzard as the beginning of a massive cover-up. A cover-up which included the planting of evidence by state police in order to frame an innocent woman. A cover-up which required the participation of multiple people inside the house, including a federal cop, as well as friends and family of Albert. A cover-up which required local police to look the other way and might require complicity from the medical examiner, doctors in the emergency room, and the state police lab, not to mention the prosecutors. However, there are a lot of strange aspects to the case that add fuel to the conspiracy theories. That includes what seems to be an FBI investigation, possibly a federal grand jury. In this series, we're going to shed light on all of these things. It's going to get crazy. Another element is the people eager to capitalize on the situation, such as YouTubers like myself. A lot of us have had a personal interest in there being a conspiracy. Maybe that's clouded our judgment. It can be easy to rationalize you're fighting for justice when you're really just doing what's in your own interest. And well-intentioned people can be easily manipulated by one side or the other. This is the beginning of a series where I'm going to try to sort my way through the various issues, beginning today with the fatal head wound. I'm going to give you something that no one else has, something you're going to hear here first. A sensible theory, how that fatal wound might have been caused by the SUV without injuring his back or shoulder. I'm going to show you how the abrasions were caused. I'm even going to show you how John ended up strangely 12 feet onto the lawn. I'll show you how the cocktail glass got in the bumper along with the human hair. Also, the reported speed of Karen's SUV will now make sense. In fact, you'll even see how Karen could have unknowingly done this. A three-point turn may or may not have happened, but one isn't required for this theory. And I'm not only going to explain all this to you, I'm going to show you with an animation. Later in the series, I'm going to answer many of the big questions. The infamous search for how long to die in the cold. The taillight pieces found in the snow and why Canton police didn't find them. The notorious gap in the library video. Most tantalizing, I hope to give you what the feds are really investigating. I don't have any inside information on that, but I do finally understand it.
My theory on feds is they're like mushrooms. Feed them shit and keep them in the dark.
And it is one hell of a wild story. When it comes out, gasps are going to sound all across New England, most especially in the Testodyne world, where the riders ride and bullhorns blare. For those of you outside New England that are new to the case, let me give you a quick overview. If you like true crime, you won't be disappointed by getting into this case because it really has everything. Twists and turns, heroes and villains, mobs with proverbial pitchforks, friction between friends and family, untrustworthy news media, and oh yeah, a little yellow cottage. Because though we didn't ask for it, this channel has found itself a tiny little spot on the stage. On January 29th, 2022, Boston cop John O'Keefe and his girlfriend Karen Read left a downtown bar in Canton, a suburb of Boston, to go to an after-hours party at the home of another Boston cop, Brian Albert. It was around midnight. They'd been drinking heavily all night. When they reached the Waterfall pub, they ran into a small group of people they were familiar with. This included Albert, ATF agent Brian Higgins, and Jen McCabe, the sister-in-law of Albert. Karen Read didn't really know any of these people well except maybe Higgins. O'Keefe was friendly only with McCabe, though he did know the others. The group drank together for a time. When the bar was closing, Jen McCabe invited the couple to join them at an after-hours party at Albert's house. There'd already been a birthday party going on there for their 23-year-old son. O'Keefe was slightly familiar with Albert, a high-profile Boston cop, but John had never been to Albert's home, even though they both lived in the town of Canton. Albert was from Canton. O'Keefe was not. The Alberts were a very established family in the town. Brian's brother Kevin is a Canton cop. His other brother Chris is on the board of selectmen and also owns a pizza shop in town. The Alberts and their wives had all been at the top of the social pecking order in high school. Brian fought for his country in Iraq, and he's a decorated Boston cop. However, these are men that like to drink and like to fight. There were several Canton cops that lived in the immediate area around Brian Albert, including the deputy chief, Kelleher, who lived right across the street. O'Keefe left the bar with a cocktail glass in hand. Reed did the driving in her SUV. It was snowing lightly, and the next day that snow would become a blizzard. Jen McCabe communicated with them multiple times as they journeyed from the bar to Albert's house, perhaps a 10-minute drive in those conditions. A key witness, Ryan Nagel, arrived at the house at the same time as Reed and O'Keefe. He was there to pick up his sister, who was at the party. Nagel watched Reed pull up in front of the driveway. He saw no one get out. A short time later, Karen pulled further up, perhaps thinking the truck Nagel was in wanted to move into the driveway. At no point did Nagel see anyone get out of Karen's SUV. Nagel stayed parked there for about 5 minutes. His sister came out to tell him she decided to stay at the party. At that point, they drove off, passing Reed's SUV. He testified to seeing Reed sitting with her hands on the wheel, looking forward. He saw no one else in the vehicle. He saw no one outside the vehicle, though it was a dark area with no streetlight. Now, around this point, most evidence is in dispute. Both the prosecution and the defense have hired independent forensic data experts, and they disagree about fundamental facts. It's a little surprising that in this day and age of data, basic aspects of this case are in dispute, but it turns out arriving at forensic data conclusions is complicated. There can be a degree of interpretation. Let's go over some of the data that's agreed on. At 12:14, O'Keefe texted Jen McCabe to ask for the address they were heading to. She replied to him, and then at 12:18, O'Keefe called for more information. O'Keefe's phone showed he, or it, last moved at 12:32. 12:32. Doesn't move again until the police pick it up on the lawn after O'Keefe was loaded into the ambulance, not breathing. The prosecution tells us that 12:32 is the time that Karen slammed her SUV in reverse into John O'Keefe. The defense will argue that at 12:32, someone inside the house tossed O'Keefe's phone out onto the snowy lawn. So there are three basic possibilities in this case. One, Karen struck John without realizing it and went home to O'Keefe's house. Two, Karen knowingly struck him and left him to die in the blizzard alone on the lawn. Presumably this is what the prosecution is arguing, since they've charged Karen with second-degree murder. Second degree means murder with malicious intent, but not premeditated. An incredibly serious charge indicating Reed backed into O'Keefe on purpose, or at least left him on purpose. The third possibility about what happened to John O'Keefe is that he went into the house, was assaulted, and then later moved to the lawn by the killers in the first step of an elaborate conspiracy. But hold on to your hat before you dismiss such a conspiracy. Hold my hat! Because there's an awful lot of smoke here to indicate the possibility of a fire. However, let's begin with the prosecution's case. The physical evidence from the crime scene, namely shards of taillight glass, the testimony of 11 witnesses inside the house, and the medical examiner's report, all strongly indicate Karen's SUV struck O'Keefe, that he never entered the home and was never in any kind of altercation. For this evidence to be wrong requires a very large conspiracy involving everyone in the house, local and state police, and perhaps the medical examiner. It requires people that have never committed a crime to become accomplices to murder. It requires local police to look the other way. It requires the state trooper to either plant evidence or to intentionally enable the planting of evidence. It requires the state police to purposely withhold evidence that might help the defense. What possible motive could there be for all these people to risk their liberty and their careers to participate in this? If a trooper plants evidence in a murder case to frame an innocent person, he's going to jail for a very long time. What motive could he have to risk that? The motive has to be powerful enough to justify such tremendous risk. Another problem for the defense is the timeline, which perfectly fits the prosecution theory. The time Karen got home to John's house is known with certainty because she was calling John as she pulled into the garage. The garage door is heard closing on the message on John's phone. That was exactly 12:41. John's phone stopped moving on the lawn at 12:32. The drive from the house on Fairview to John's house is normally about 7 minutes, but Karen was drunk, not familiar with the neighborhood, and it was dark and snowing. So 10 minutes sounds just about right. But in this episode, I want to focus on John's injuries. We do have to show autopsy photos, so please be warned. Here's the fatal wound. It's deep. The injury crushed several bones in the skull, and that's what led to the swelling of the eyes you see here. There are abrasions on his arm. The defense claims this is the result of a dog attack. There was a German Shepherd inside the home, and it did have a reputation of attacking people. In fact, strangely, the owner rehomed it later. The defense points to this with suspicion. Apparently, the hope is they will match DNA from the dog to DNA that might be found on the victim's clothing, if any is found. There also was a bruise on the hand. Possibly that bruise could be explained in other ways since this is a corpse, but the defense is arguing that this was evidence John was in a fight. But for me, the real problem in this case is not so much the injuries as the lack of injuries. Without a plausible accident reconstruction of how Karen killed John with her SUV, there's no case. In the next episode, we'll go over the taillight evidence in detail. But for now, let's just say this. A large piece of taillight plastic was found at the scene, and a bunch of smaller pieces. In addition, recent analysis of the clothing showed the presence of microscopic taillight plastic. So unless there's some highly unlikely conspiracy, Karen's SUV cracked and shed pieces as the result of the accident. An attorney named Wendy Murphy offered an explanation of the accident that's so absurd, it demonstrates the problem with envisioning what happened.
If she backs up and hits him and she can't see him because he fell on his ass before she knocked him over, which would make sense. That's where his injury is, right above his right eye. He gets slammed back and fractures his skull, which is how he ends up dying, apparently. There's some hypothermia too.
So according to Wendy, John fell, was in a sitting position, was struck in the front by the SUV, and hit his head on an object. It couldn't have happened this way, because there are no wounds on the front of John's body. I've heard many similar theories that John was knocked into the nearby fire hydrant or the electrical box. None of that works. A good friend of this channel, Dave Jenkins, a former federal law enforcement officer, one of the best guys to bounce ideas off, theorized that maybe the injury to his front simply wasn't visible because injuries to the body can be unusual. In his time in law enforcement, he'd witnessed many unusual injuries. But there's a problem you have to get past. Karen's taillight broke as the result of the collision. So if the taillight didn't strike John on the back of the head, where did it strike? It hit something hard enough to break, and there are no other wounds on the body. So if Karen's SUV struck John O'Keefe, it had to strike him on the back of the head, creating the deep gash, crushing bones, and ultimately killing him. However, this has troubled me for months. It was the main reason I couldn't fathom the prosecution's case. I came to understand eventually that the 227 search for how long to die in the cold was, at best, uncertain. I figured out why the Ken police didn't find the taillight glass. I even came up with a good explanation for the FBI, but the head injury stumped me because I couldn't imagine how a car could strike John in the back of the head and not injure his back or his shoulder. Until I figured it out. I'm going to show you in a moment what happened, but I need to re-emphasize the problem. A taillight is about 28 inches off the ground. John was 6'2". The taillight had to strike him in the back of the head. There are no other injuries, and the taillight split open and shed pieces. Microscopic taillight plastic was found on John's clothing. Other than the abrasions on his arm, there's nothing else, no other injuries. So let's say John slips and lands on his ass. The SUV strikes him directly from behind. Well, the head sits slightly forward on the neck, and the bumper extends slightly past the taillight on the vehicle. So there's no way the SUV wouldn't do serious damage to John's back. Or let's say the SUV was coming at him from the side and he turned at the last second and it hit him in the head. But again, part of the vehicle would strike him in the shoulder first and do tremendous damage. But then after months, it finally occurred to me. John was bending down to pick up the cocktail glass he just dropped. Or maybe it was his phone. Here's the first way I imagined it. In this view, he's facing the car, bends down, and she backs into him. It might have happened this way, but the problem with this theory is that it requires Karen to hit the brakes at just the right moment, right as the SUV strikes him in the head. Otherwise, there'd be more damage to him, possibly even a broken neck. I felt like this theory was possible, close, but not quite right. Then I came to a better understanding, and I'd bet the farm this is how it happened. And this explains the reported high rate of speed. She was going in reverse, a little recklessly. She was angry and drunk. I doubt she had any idea he was there. You can see how the SUV brushed against one arm. In the video, it's his left, but in the actual event, it was his right. It would account for the bruise on the hand. Because the cocktail glass was in his hand, a piece ended up on the bumper. It stuck there in the ice, along with a human hair. It also accounts for John being found 12 feet onto the lawn. The blow was a glancing one. The force from the vehicle didn't so much send him back as the body's reaction from being struck a crushing blow to the head. He staggered back a few steps, dropping his phone again in the process, and fell, never to move again. It's tragic for so many people. John died alone in the snow, a long, slow process that took hours. If it happened this way, Karen's life is ruined. But think about the harm done to other people accused of being masterminds of an extremely unlikely cover-up. Look, I don't dismiss other possibilities. I don't completely reject the theory that John was attacked inside the house. There are several odd aspects of this case, and we'll go over all of them. But this is the most probable theory of how the accident happened. Next up, the part of the theory most important to the defense, the taillight glass. Was it planted by corrupt state police?